Do you read Stephen King? Good news, there's a club for you. The Losers Club. And guess what? You don't have to die at the hands of a shape-shifting clown to join. No, all you have to do is tune in every Friday as us losers journey through the never-ending wastelands of King's Dominion. Each week, we'll either spend hours reading between the pages of one of his books or chew on his latest tweets and Hollywood headlines. What's more, we're always having guests over. Thomas Jane, Mick Garris, Jerry O'Connell, Mary Lambert, Will Wheaton, and the list goes on. So what are you waiting for? Join us as we read on through long days and pleasant nights.
Consequence Podcast Network.
Welcome to another edition of Kyle Meredith With. It's an audio interview series presented by WFPK Independent Louisville at WFPK.org, Consequence of Sound, and the Consequence Podcast Network. Wherever you're listening from today, hit that subscribe button right now so you can keep up with these interviews and the series. I'm Kyle Meredith. Today my guest is the legendary Rod Argent of the Zombies. They're currently on tour, somewhat celebrating the 50th anniversary of their landmark record, Odyssey and Oracle. We'll talk about what it was like recording that record, how it sort of went really far under the radar until a few years later, about how one of the songs, A Rose for Emily, found new prominence in the S-Town podcast series. And we'll also talk about next year. His band Argent turns 50 years old, so we're going to see if they're going to be celebrating that. We'll also hit on a couple of his lesser-known solo records, Moving Home and Red House, also celebrating big anniversaries this year, and what we should expect from the Zombies in the future. It's Kyle Meredith with Rod Argent of the Zombies. Let's start with the most recent news from the Zombies, I guess. You guys are about to take a West Coast trek, is that right?
Absolutely, yeah. We're going. We're flying out at the beginning of September, and I believe we're over there for 3 weeks. Actually,
I saw one of those dates. Do I have this right? You're playing with Arcade Fire?
We are playing with Arcade Fire. Apparently, they really wanted us on, which is very sweet, very nice.
Was there any reason? Is that a special event planned, or it's just like, hey, this is on our wish list and we'd like to do this?
Well, I mean, I think they actually got in touch with us, as far as I understand, and they really wanted us to do the show with them. Ooh. So I don't know whether they've seen us or, what the situation is exactly, because it was all organised through our management, our American management company. But it's something we're really looking forward to.
I know that probably puts you in front of a different audience. I mean, the Zombies are an institution at this point, but I'm sure, it's probably a very different show for you all being in front of something, I don't know, that young.
Well, I mean, you say that, but and you're probably right. But do you know what? We always have a young component in our audience. I mean, it's a mix of ages usually. But there's almost always quite a large young component in our audience anyway. People that seem to have been turned on, particularly to Odyssey and Oracle, but the new stuff as well, by quite often, a lot of emerging independent bands talk about us. And maybe that gets their younger fans to check us out, or check out what they're talking about. But I have to say, we always have a few young bands in the audience there to see us. And we usually have quite a substantial component of a young audience as well.
Last year, one of your songs, A Rose for Emily, sort of found itself back into popular culture because of the S-Town podcast. Did you see any effect from that on your end? Was that noticeable to you all?
Well, there were several things last year. I mean, that was absolutely one. And you know what? I've never heard the podcast, but I hear it's really good. So I still mean to check it out at some point. But no, that was terrific. The fact that each episode ended with a rose for Emily. And of course, we also had, there have been several things with Time of the Season recently. Mm-hmm. There was the film about John Paul Getty, All the Money in the World. Mm-hmm. Time of the Season was in that. And that was the main thing on the trailer for that film. Just a year before that, or maybe it was 2 years before that, Eminem sampled heavily Time of the Season and did a very clever thing with turning it very much sound-alike writing in the lyrics, but turning the meaning absolutely around. That was a very clever thing for him to do, I think. So there are one or two things that tend to come up all the time, and we're very grateful for that, I have to say.
Time of the Season, the song that just keeps on giving. Year after year after year.
Well, it does, yeah. And I'm really grateful for that.
Do you get to reach out to Eminem at all? Was there any kind of conversation that goes on with that, or do you just get the call like that he would like to use the sample, and that's the extent.
Let me tell you what happened with the Eminem thing. My publisher phoned up and said, Eminem wants to use your song. I said, okay, but he wants you to, I said, we have to hear it. And I said, okay. And she said, but it has to be done in the next couple of days. I said, oh, my God, okay. And then she came back to me and said, the problem is he doesn't like to have his stuff out on the net, before it comes out. So I don't know quite how you're going to hear it. And I said, well, there's no other way of me hearing it. So in the end, he sent me a link that was just for 2 hours on my, personal email. And I checked it out on there. And I loved it, actually. I thought it was really good because it wasn't just a copy or something, taking from what was there. He used it really cleverly. As I said, he turned the meaning on its head, but in a very clever way. So I loved it. So that was how I got to approve that particular one.
That's such an interesting, it's something you've done at certain points in your life. The way they just kind of you get to hear them in such a different lights, all these years later. That must be really a cool thing.
I think it is, yeah. I mean, it's always lovely when somebody covers something as a cover. I think perhaps my favourite cover of one of my songs was Carlos Santana doing She's Not There. Oh, yeah. And that was, of course, way back in the 70s. And that's always great. But when someone puts a completely different slant on what you've done, but uses it as a jumping off point, then yeah, that's very cool.
Well, I want to hit a few of the big round numbers this year, and not just the 50th. There are a handful here, but I thought we would start with that one because it's still the 50th anniversary of Odyssey and Oracle. When you have a record that's been celebrated so many times and for so long, and for the good reasons, by the way, this is the masterpieces of the 60s right here. Does a record like this still change for you after this long, or did it eventually arrive to its resting place at some point along the road?
It took me completely by surprise. I mean, the story there was that it came out and it didn't do anything anywhere. And even when 18 months later we had a number one record in Cashbox in the States, number 2 or 3 in Billboard, I think. And then it became number one in many, many places in the world. Odyssey and Oracle, the album, didn't really sell, even on the back of that. And then about 12 years later, I had a phone call from Chris White, the original bass player in our band, saying, I just thought you'd like to know my kids are at college. And it's becoming a real cult album. I said, oh, yeah. And I put the phone down and I said to my wife, no, it's not. But it was. but it was. And in fact, it was when people like Paul Weller, who was one of the biggest, and still is one of the biggest UK stars over here.
Oh, yeah.
Bigger than he is I know he means something as an independent in the States, but over here, he's absolutely enormous. He quoted that when he was number one in the charts with the Jam, the height of the punk thing, he said that Odyssey and Oracle was his favourite album of all time. And that's something he says to this day as well. So that completely took us by surprise. And do you know what? I hadn't listened in that 10 to 12 years. I don't think I'd played Odyssey and Oracle at all. I'd forgotten what it sounded like. And I sort of rediscovered it myself, but never thought that I'd ever be playing it. At that time, I came off the road, I thought, for good. I mean, I was heavily involved in music, but I was producing albums and playing on albums for other people. I was doing TV scores, etc. And I got back together with Colin, completely by accident in around the year 2000. And it was years after that when somebody floated the idea. It was Chris, actually, who floated the idea. He said, we've never played this. Why don't we do it? So we decided to do it. And we decided to do it by reproducing every single note that was on the original album. And to do that, we got some of our friends like Darian Sahanaja from the Brian Wilson band, who I knew that he knew every note that was on Odyssey and Oracle. So he played some backup keyboards for me on that, on the overdubs that I'd done on the original one. We got 1 or 2 extra people in to do the extra overdubbed harmonies that we'd done on the original, etc., etc. So it was a complete surprise to us, and it's been a joy to do it.
Well, those sounds on that record, I mean, some of the sounds on that record, especially what was happening, at the time, it sounded like they come from a different planet almost. Where was all that coming from? Because there was so much going on that was brand new, musically speaking.
I think in the sense, I think you're right in a way, because when I went back and played it after that long period of not playing it, it was much different to what I'd remembered. It didn't sound like, it sounded just like itself and nothing else. And I think that that's one of the reasons why we often had trouble initially, getting a sequence of hit records, because we never tried to jump on the coattails of whatever was going on. We always got excited about a musical idea and then just tried to make it work, and worked it through without thinking what's fashionable at the moment, what might get us played on the radio, etc., etc. We never thought like that. And certainly with Odyssey and Oracle, we just came up with some ideas and got excited about them and went in and recorded them very quickly. I mean, it was done over a period of several months, but the actual recording of each track was just about 3 hours for each track from start to finish, because we didn't have enough money for anything else. We honestly didn't.
Yeah.
CBS gave us £1,000 for the whole album.
Wow.
To record the whole album. And even then, that wasn't very much money. And we went into Abbey Road, which was an expensive studio. So we had to really prepare the tracks before going in. And then we would put what we'd rehearsed extensively down in about, I guess, an hour and a half or something. And then any spontaneous ideas that we had, because there were extra tracks available to us, we would use that spontaneity as well. So, maybe put on an extra harmony that occurred to us in the studio. So it was a really good combination of preparedness and spontaneity for us. And it just felt lovely to do it. But we honestly thought that, after it was finished and we put the first single out, which was Carousel 44, and nothing happened, we thought, well, that's it. It's been nice, but we decided to break up because some of the guys were really strapped for cash. And luckily for me and Chris, the writers, we found out much later that we usually had a hit somewhere in the world, but the world was a much bigger place in those days. You often didn't know what was happening,
right.
Until months later. It's very different to now. You can have a hit out of Mongolia now and know within an hour, but in those days you didn't. You really didn't. So it was a bit of a strange time. But I do think that the fact that we just looked at the thing honestly and tried to just follow our enthusiasms meant that we ended up with something which didn't really sound quite like anything else that was around. And at the time, that did us a disfavour by it not sounding fashionable enough for people to latch on to immediately. But in the long run, I think it means it can still actually relate to people now. And as I said, we get 18, 20-year-olds coming up to us and saying, this is my favourite album, etc., etc. And it feels amazing to me that something we did so long ago can, still has the power to actually relate to a current generation, still talk, still mean something. So, I think in the long run, it did us a favour.
I know it was recorded, it was released in 68. It was recorded summer of and fall of 67, I think, which kind of makes it a Summer of Love record. And there is some innocence to it. But when I look at the timeline, like that tone would change so much 2 years later with the start of Argent, in 1969, which, by the way, 50th anniversary of that next year. But that was it almost seems like a very, very big musical jump, like a completely different sandbox to what you'd done 2 years prior.
No, I have to disagree with you, because in fact, if you listen to the first Argent album, the very first one, and the first two Argent albums, that's before the one with Hold Your Head Up on it.
Mm-hmm.
The first two, in other words, Argent and Ring of Hand. I think that the first album, Argent, sounds absolutely like a continuation of the Zombies. I really, really do. But things change very quickly. I mean, can you imagine how different the Beatles stuff was,
right,
from I Want to Hold Your Hand to things like, well, whatever you want to choose, Revolution Number 9, but things that weren't so out there as that. They were completely different pieces of music, completely different, because when you're that age, you're just hungry to explore different areas all the time. And you always want to be on the cutting edge. I mean, something like Odyssey and Oracle and something like the Beatles' early stuff doesn't sound like cutting edge now, but it did when it came out. The Beatles stuff was revolutionary when it came out. It was like nothing else that was around, the very first Beatles records. It's so hard for people to realize that now, because, we're looking from a point of view of many years later. But if you were contemporary at that time, but the first couple of Argent albums, they did progress into other things quite quickly. But I honestly feel that Argent and Ring of Hands were, and they were certainly the reviews over in the UK absolutely treated the Argent album like a continuation of the Zombies. But of course, there were different musicians involved, and you always write and explore according to the abilities and the character of the different musicians that are involved. I mean, that's inevitable. I mean, look at the difference between the early Fleetwood Mac stuff and then the later stuff that came on, after Peter Green left, et cetera, and when you've got real personnel changes. It's inevitable, really. And the one with Hold Your Head Up on it, which I think is a very mixed bag. It's got 2 or 3 really good tracks on it, and some that have a very different orientation. But the first 2 albums, I don't think are dark at all. I don't have that dark. I do understand what you're saying, and I understand about some of Russ's writing with Lonely Hard Road on the first album, I think, or was it Ring of Hands? But some of the early things on the first Argent album were very romantic and very full of the character of the Zombies. I feel, with the harmonies, similar bits of improvisation. I think it very much had the character. But of course, by the time of Hold Your Head Up, which strangely enough, most people think I wrote that, but 90% of that song was written by Chris White, the original bass player in the Zombies. But it was moulded by the character of the musicians on Argent. And in fact, strangely enough, Hold Your Head Up was a first take. The drummer had never heard it. And we actually did 35 takes of that song, and we went back and used take 1.
That's funny. Are you planning anything for the 50th of that band as well?
I don't think so, because I tell you what, as I've got older, both Colin and I give everything to the Zombies, and it's, giving one band everything I've got, it's quite enough for me. And it is important to us to try and continue to write. I mean, we've always done that. And in fact, our last album knocked us out so completely because when it came out in late 2015, we got a phone call from Billboard saying, we were on tour, and it said, we just wanted to let you know that it's actually made the top 100 album sales. And they said, for the first time in 50 years as the Zombies, you've made the top 100 album sales. And that completely knocked us out, because that, in a way, is more important than anything to us, because we're not just interested in trying to rake over the coals. We still are doing it because of the energy we get from writing and recording and making things work, and getting energy back from the audience when we play new songs. We can play over in the States or anywhere. We can play Time the Season and get a fantastic response. And we can follow that from a track from our last album and get a wonderful response on that as well. And that completely knocks us out. And from young kids as well, young people that are there, not just people that have followed us all the way through. Although I'm not being ageist when I say that. I mean, I love anyone coming on to see us. It's just brilliant.
It gives that album title, Still Got That Hunger. I mean, that's what a perfect sentiment, you know?
That's exactly why it's called that, really, yeah.
I'm going to try to pivot a little bit to just bring up one more anniversary, because there are 2 records that completely get overlooked. I believe they're out of print right now. Moving Home and Red House. Moving Home, 40 years old this year. Red House is 30. I mean, you do like releasing on the big round 10-year numbers here. I don't know if you've listened to those in a while, but they're such fun records to listen to, and I feel like they're sort of forgotten right now to the general public anyway.
I think they really are. And Moving Home, it's not possible to get copies. Not on a. I mean, that was recorded on MCA, I think, and they never released it on CD. So it was, there's never been a digital release of that. So it's very, very hard to get that. Red House was done because a production colleague of mine, Pete Van Hook, who was originally a drummer with Van Morrison, Pete and I teamed up, and we had some huge success, actually, producing and playing on albums for other people. We did Sunita Tikram's first album, which did 4.5 million albums in Europe. I know it wasn't as popular in America, but it was a huge album. And we produced a Josh Callison album that had 3 hit records in the States. Nancy Griffith, several things. But he had his own record label called MMC, and he said to me, while we were producing, he said, look, I'd like you to do an album for me, Rod. And I said, well, what sort of album? He said, it's got to be basically an instrumental album and with a sort of new age-ish feeling. He said, that's the character of what we're trying to put out on MMC at the moment. And I said, okay, I'll do that. And, I gave it my best shot with that in mind. And I was really, really pleased with what came out on that album. I think it's got a really good character, and I'm so pleased that you've heard of it.
Well, I'd love to see some issues of those, especially moving home. I mean, considering beyond just the good music, I mean, what Phil Collins and Gary Moore as a part of that one, right? Like you'd think that would get more attention. Yeah, that would probably get more attention than I think it has. Just consider the three of you all.
Well, do you know what? I mean, I don't know if it's. I can't see that it's come out, but Phil Collins, through somebody else, got in touch with me recently and said that he can't find a copy of a track on that album called Home because he was going to release a big compilation album which included his favourite contributions to other people, basically. And Home was going to be one of those. I mean, I haven't seen it come out, but that was from Moving Home. Yeah. And I know Phil loved playing on that.
Would love to hear that. Well, I know we're running out of time here. I thank you for jumping back in the time machine. And it sounds like there still will be new music around some corner if you guys are still writing. So that's exciting.
Yeah. Absolutely. I'm really looking forward now because we've toured the new album for a couple of years. The last album for a couple of years. So I'm really looking forward now to, putting the writing cap on again. And I just, my wife and I moved house after 38 years. So I had to build a new studio here, which has just been completed. So I'm really looking forward to getting those creative juices going again and doing the next album.
Yeah, I look forward to hearing it. Rod, thank you so much for the talk today and have fun on that tour out there.
I'm sure we will. Thanks so much.
All right. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye. Big ol' thanks to Rod Argent of the Zombies for giving me that call right there. Don't forget, you can subscribe to Consequence of Sound's YouTube channel right now to keep up with your favorite artists and interviews. For you podcast fans, iTunes, Podchaser, wherever you're getting this from, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Then give a rating, leave a review. It goes a long way for us. Then you can head over to WFPK.org. That's where I do a show every Monday through Thursday from noon to 3 Eastern. You'll also find some bonus episodes of this series over there. I'm Kyle Meredith. I'll see you next time.
Consequence Podcast Network.